Alex, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with me today.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, we were just talking, everyone, right before we jumped on here. Alex was faculty at Chautauqua this summer. And so I had the honor of being able to hang out for a couple of weeks and get to know her and her work and hear her artists talk. So I'm really excited to have you on the show. So again, just thank you for that.
Ah, that's so exciting. Thank you so much for having me.
So I would like to start out just at the beginning and talking a little bit about, your background and how you first really became interested in the arts and knew like this is it, this is my thing.
I think in a lot of ways, I grew up in an art-centered family. My dad does drawing and illustration. My mom does design and went to school for painting and, had a children's clothing business for a while. And my stepmother designed fabrics. And so it's kind of what we did in our family just to kind of keep occupied, right? And I kind of remember that there were always just like bags of materials places, right? Whether in like my mom's workroom or just sort of art supplies that my family had accumulated. And I think that's one of the things as an artist, right? Like you accumulate materials and then like you just have things around kind of in pockets of spaces. And so there's that kind of like reaching for things in kind of different moments of filling time that started to set up that kind of materials as your second brain, right? Kind of like using materials, touching materials as kind of like a second way of thinking that was just kind of in our houses. My at both my dad and my stepmom's and my mom's house. And then for me, a lot of it is sort of growing up. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York. And so always had access to kind of tons of art around. I spent a lot of time at the Met Museum and the Brooklyn Museum and the Natural History Museum. And I think actually that my love of sort of Beaux-Arts museums kind of comes from the Met. And then also like when I was in high school, it was a suggested donation at that point. So it was like kind of 50 cents to go for the afternoon if I didn't know what else to do with my time. And then, I loved the Natural History Museum as a kid as both a place of kind of reverence in what was being set up in these dioramas, and then also something deeply upsetting in some of the spaces in terms of what was being set up in those dioramas, right? And I think that there was something in that place about the kind of these three-dimensional paintings, these dioramas as like these kind of pictorial kind of spaces, these really like fixed kind of moments, right, of kind of pictorial interaction that were really compelling to me. But then also I had so many questions about sort of like what this sort of history of nature more, and what does it mean to fix history, and whose history, and how is history kind of told. And those were all things that were kind of like there under the surface as this sort of like unsettling part of so much of the kind of idea of collection that's happening in the Natural History Museum. But I think it either way definitely had a big influence. So I think that those were kind of really big places for me kind of growing up that led into sort of visual culture and visual thinking.
It's so interesting hearing you talk about your time at the Natural History Museum, knowing your work. I'm like, oh my goodness, I can so see where the threads, like where they kind of began for you in a lot of ways in terms of talking about history, who's writing the history, these fixed moments, because you're right. Like there's this beauty and interest in being in like the Natural History Museum. It's dark. You get to see the little scenes and dioramas.
Yeah.
It feels a little like I almost want to say like mystical for some reason. You're like walking through a dream, but then it's also, like you said, unsettling because it becomes like, wait, what? Why this? Why are we putting this with this? how is the, these stories that are being told, which again, I think it comes out in your work now. So I'd love to fast forward a little bit. You were growing up in Brooklyn, you were 50 cents for the Met. I love it. Places. Um, so let's talk a little bit about going off to school, studying art. Was there anything, because you had such a advanced experience, I think, compared to a lot of art students, what was that like for you going into school and studying art?
So I actually didn't go into undergrad studying art. I went to Connecticut College, which is a liberal arts college, and started out as an anthropology major. And I actually think that I didn't go in wanting to be an artist. And then started taking a mix of classes. And in the anthropology department, I was really kind of more interested in sort of deconstructing or understanding aspects of American culture as opposed to I guess we would kind of refer to it, and this is a really old-fashioned term, but it kind of felt that way at the time, a little bit of sort of like an armchair anthropology kind of department. And I couldn't really find my place in there. I also, writing in I didn't understand ethnographic writing. And that was really what occurred to me by the time I was a junior, is that it was just a form of writing that I didn't fully understand. And I had been taking art classes. Again, it was just a way of sort of settling myself, understanding things, synthesizing things. And I started to realize that the emphasis of what I was doing was really kind of like taking me back into the art department. So I became a double major for a while. And then kind of the anthropology, the project that I was working on, there just wasn't someone to work on it with me there. And I was working on a project that was about sort of lighting in big box retail stores like Costco and Walmart. And I was really interested in like the lighting schemes of what it meant to kind of inhabit these like warehouses that were set up as warehouses, but they weren't really. So anyway, I love this whole thing. And then I just kind of decided that so many of the questions that I could ask about culture, space, my curiosities, I could do as an artist. And it would take me longer to really understand that fully. But I started to realize that a lot of my kind of like cultural questions I could address through my painting. And that was really exciting. And so I fully kind of switched over into the art department and was able to kind of give my focus there. And then decided to go to graduate school pretty soon after that. I kind of spent the year after undergrad building up a portfolio and just making paintings on the side of working. And my apartment turned into a studio, as it does for so many of us. And then went to Mass Art in Boston for grad school.
Awesome. I love what you say there, which is like your cultural questions you could answer as an artist. So we were kind of touching on this before we jumped into this interview, but there is such an openness in the arts, right? Like we were talking about all the different hats we wear. And so I love this idea of like, you this studying anthropology, to make so much sense with your interest as a child, your interest as an adult, but then like this visual part that you have, like this mastery of, or this ability to work with and bring it all together. You can work that way. It reminds me of something you said in your artist talk, your artist lecture at Chautauqua, which is you said something like, your friends would notice that you would get really passionate about, it might be politics, it might be, I don't know, lighting at Costco, just these different things. And you were trying to bring that more into your work. So like finding something you're passionate about that you can make work with, which you do. Could you talk a little bit about that, about bringing the passion and your interests, so those cultural interests maybe into the arts for you?
Yeah, I'm primarily a painter and drawer, and sometimes that leads me into dimensional space and installation. But the question of what to make work about, right, is always it's kind of at the heart of then how you use materials and how the formats inform the idea. And one of the things I was kind of finding about myself early on in my career, I was working with kind of animal forms. I was doing a lot of drawing, was working with animal forms as sort of these kind of psychopomps almost to think about environmental fragility and instability and landscape. Kind of again, going back a little bit to like the diorama boxes at the Natural History Museum, kind of really thinking about what it means to kind of pictorialize a landscape and the meaning inside. And I think that I was interested in kind of, again, that sort of like the collision of the material to the idea. And then after a while, I started to realize that I didn't know exactly how to answer questions about environmental fragility by itself as an artist, right? Like I can ask questions about climate change and resource extraction and these kind of questions, but I do best when I'm making kind of connections to other points of history or ideas or kind of cultural questions. And so I was sort of like working along in this series, and I was at a residency, and I had a friend who did notice that I loved kind of talking about politics in these really kind of expansive ways about sort of like racial capitalism and racial construction. And they were just like, when you talk about your work, it's kind of a little bit like going through the motions. You sort of talk about sort of animal bodies and sort of like this alternative space and this, fictional world, but you seem so much more engaged with these other aspects of how to bring these kind of questions to bear in a more interconnected way. And I had to think about that. That was like, I was kind of living in New York at the time and working, and I was teaching as an adjunct and at a few different schools. And so teaching is always a question of a way to think about materials that is both in the classroom and out of the classroom, in the studio, out of the studio, right? And so I loved that comment because it kind of felt a little bit like a challenge to me from a friend, right? So I think that becoming kind of aware of where your interests are, what you do well, what excites you to keep on making something. Those are things that kind of, for me anyway, kind of unfolded over time. And then I would start to find ways of getting to that material and ways of making those connections. And I sort of via a project kind of stumbled into working from archival sources and thinking a lot more about historical materials. And it was really kind of just these sort of steps and sort of stumbling into it via an interest in this set of paintings that was in the Met show, Interwoven Globe, 1500 to 1800. So show at the Met. And there was this suite of Agostino Brunia's paintings kind of towards the end of the show. And that was a place where all of these unexpected kind of questions and sets of relations could kind of wiggle out almost, right? And I could go, oh, I'm doing this. Oh, I'm doing this. Oh, this is really interesting. So I think that even though I didn't kind of in a formal way, like use my anthropology degree, well, I didn't get one, but that sort of training, it came back. It came back, right? In kind of a neat and not immediately obvious way, right? I still don't know how to write an ethnography, but I still totally don't get that. But the way of thinking and the sort of like question making, that did come back.
Well, it's so wonderful because I feel like, as we go through our life, there's these interests or these moments or something that happens that then years later, we're like, oh, look at that. For example, we keep referencing the Natural History Museum, but these are the experience that build our lives. And then we're like always kind of pulling from it. And I definitely see all of that in your work. And I think that's one of the things I really loved when I was in your lecture and hearing about your work is not only how passionate you are about what you're working on, but also I really loved how you're diving into archives and you're researching in such a way that is fascinating to me, how you're pulling ideas and visuals together. So I would love for you to share a little bit about how that has been for you. If you want to maybe pick a project or maybe something you're working on now with how you are engaging with the archives.
Yeah. I'll say it's come upon it happens in different ways. So I don't think that I have like a kind of project strategy for working with historical materials. They have it's projects have sort of happened differently, which I think is also really interesting. So one of the things, well, I guess maybe I'll talk about History Constructs the House, which was a project that in 2020, so like in the pandemic, kind of in the early stages of it, I was invited to make a piece for a show that was in a group show in Art Space in New Haven that was based around the 50th anniversary of the May Day protests and the simultaneous Black Panther trials happening in New Haven. And I was thinking about like what could be different ways to approach the legacy of the Panthers and also sort of the trial of Erica Hudgens and Bobby Seale. And then I was kind of thinking about housing, right, as one of the platform of the Panthers, housing equity, and thinking about for such a long time now, since 2008 especially, but for a really long time, how the inequity in our housing market and the sort of like long-standing visibility of this problem, that there's this, I think, kind of structural refusal to address. And then, of course, in the pandemic, the precarity that people found themselves in. So I started thinking about what it would be to kind of take on that subject matter, not necessarily like just within the terrain of the Panthers, but sort of more broadly in New Haven. And so we started the show kind of asked us to have a few listening sessions with community elders. And so getting to know a little bit about the history, specifically in like the 60s and 70s. But then I kind of was thinking about this sort of like more long-standing relationship of the Black community in New Haven around housing. And I had been listening to in the studio this great book by Wendy Warren called New England Bound. So I grew up in New York, but like New England adjacent, but I had been teaching out at the University of Missouri for 4 years, and then got this job back at Smith and came back to the East Coast. And so when I came back, really kind of coming back to New England, I started noticing more about the kind of historical residue that exists here and how loud the historical residue is. And so this book kind of takes a look at the sort of afterlives of slavery and the sort of really complicity of New England in building these systems of enslavement in the early Atlantic. And so one of the vignettes that comes up in the book is this history of Juan's Lot. And John Juan was an enslaved man in the later part of the 1600s to the then governor of New Haven. And he is, as an older man, is manumitted and lives on the governor's property in this little plot of land that I think was over in like the 9 Squares, so pretty central in New Haven. And anyway, he gets the family contests after the death of the governor, and there's a court case. And so I was able to kind of find in the archive the documents of the court case. And it kind of became this idea, right, of like how we think about the history of an inequity or a problem and how the residue or how sort of like the structure and the ghosts of that structure sort of live on. So that was kind of the inroad, was just reading, like listening to something that happened to be where I was making something, and that happened to then also kind of dovetail with this project around my idea of thinking around housing. So I went over to the Historical Society and went into the trove of papers there that is this collection on the New Haven Housing Authority. So thinking about the urban renewal programs that span really from sort of like the latter part of the 1940s into the 50s and then early 60s, and then the Model City program. So New Haven was actually like a really big in the East Coast kind of like urban renewal hub. And so this is really what we think of as, or what we know to be sort of clearance, especially of working poor but Black and Puerto Rican communities, and in New Haven, particularly of the Black community. And so there was in several neighborhoods that then became part of sort of the grazing of land for urban renewal. And so it was really a project of a kind of colonialization, right? Like a colonial land management tool. And then people were, you know, quote unquote relocated, but you'll find in many records that people aren't always relocated during this era. So I was looking in the materials, and there were these pictures of they were almost like staged, kind of like eviction or people that were slated for clearance, that pictures were taken of them in their home. And I thought, this is so strange. Like, what a strange kind of governmental intervention to kind of like take these pictures and to set people up in these kind of familial ways. But these are clearly taken by an outside, like an agency, right? They're agency photos. They're like in the development files, the housing authority files. So in one of them, there's this picture of three people that could be a family. They could also have different sets of relations, right? And behind them, in this very kind of like middle class living room, there's this New England wall. And it reminded me of, you know, kind of like New England wall scene in itself is really an image, a very bucolic and I don't know, a very bucolic and kind of accepted image of native erasure, right? It's sort of like in the European style that has like these little landscapes peppered through, and it's like this repeating pattern, right? But really, we're talking about native erasure, and again, a story of kind of colonialization. So I decided to make a series of 17 drawings that were taking from the different things I was finding in the archive, historical materials, kind of repositioned to sort of tell a story about community, both resistance to and the reality of what clearance and redevelopment meant within the community at the time, and the way that this directly connects to the housing instability that we see in the present, right? But also kind of thinking of like, we experience and we express ideas around race in many different ways, but within the landscape of the US, race is also very much about accessibility to land and housing, right? And so kind of wanting that to read through the project, right? So there's different kinds of archival or historic materials kind of embedded in the project, some from voices of community organizations, and then some from the state, right? And from different kind of like actors. And I think that kind of complexity that gets read is something that's sort of interesting to me, right? So that project then became sort of like this wallpaper project, and then I would hang some of the original drawings kind of framed inside on the wallpaper, sort of like this domestic interior space. So that's like, I felt long-winded, but that was like, it's kind of like one example of how I sort of run into things, right? Like I'll have an idea, and then I listen a lot in my studio to history books and kind of theory. And so I like save things that really strike me and kind of like write things down. So like these little notations, and then I'll be thinking about something later, and it becomes a way of bringing that thing together, right? I'm like, oh, wow, that fits so perfectly in this kind of question, or kind of troubles this idea, right? How can I then expand that more? And what does the language of painting have to do with it? Or what does the language of drawing have to do with it, right? In the History Constructs the House That Sometimes Holds Us project, it was very clear to me that it needed to be drawing and not painting, that I kind of looked at these materials and asked these questions through.
Mm-hmm. Well, I loved all of that and hearing all of that in terms of the history, which is just, riveting to hear. I love what you said, ghost of a structure, that was really beautiful in terms of talking about really hard things that have happened that have just changed the entire face of what's happening in New England and beyond, in terms of the United States. And you said, as you were going through this, and I would love to share, if you would be okay with this, some of the images of the people that are in their space, in government agencies where we're taking them from the, and they're in the archives. You shared that in your talk, and I thought those were actually really haunting to see because, there's a narrative and no narrative all at the same
Yeah.
time.
Yeah. Well,
Mhm.
and I actually only really use one of those images, and because it's a question of how they were taken that is a fraught question. And so one of them I use, and the rest I don't use. One of the main reason being that there's kids involved. They sort of staged children. The second is I don't know how many times I have to share the images to make the point, right?
Mhm.
And I think when I kind of shared when I used that first image that I encountered, I just found it so like, what's happening here? What is the impetus to kind of stage this? Is it staged? Who are these people to each other? It seems clearly in this file that has to do with like relocation. So this housing would have been cleared, right? So but I wanted to be able to kind of almost like work with the memory of this to tell this story. And so that's why the image, the drawing becomes this set of hands kind of holding an image of an image of the image, right? So you have that part of it becomes some of these questions, right? Who's holding this history? Who gets held? Who brings things? What can we make of it? What do we do with things with images or histories that are haunting to us that we can't really resolve, right? I think those were the kind of questions that were brought to bear. But in that particular kind of like set of images, that's really the only one that I share or kind of am comfortable sharing. There, and there's other things kind of like in that collection that are in the, that I'm kind of like working with. But I also very often will draw as opposed to maybe kind of like making direct kind of photo image copies. That I have to kind of like choose what stories I'm asking people to really kind of like focus in on. But it's a, and I had a residency at the Schomburg and was also looking at mid-century kind of like urban renewal, urban clearance kind of histories. And so this question comes up. And so sometimes there was a project where I used a bit more kind of like photo, and then I would sort of intervene into them by kind of drawing. But the question of what as an artist do you feel like how I'm accountable to the images and to the histories that I'm looking at, and also to the collections that I'm working with.
Accountable to the image. I'm writing that down. Um, I want to go back to one thing that you said that I found interesting, which for you were saying as you were moving through this project and you're always thinking about materials and what materials make sense for the work, what should be, and you're like, I knew it had to be drawing. Could you tell us a little bit about that and how you were like, I knew this had to be drawing for this
Yeah.
project?
Yeah, so I had just come out of this series of paintings called Difficult Love, and it was a painting project that kind of came out of looking at these historical paintings. Agostino Brunius, who was sort of like a grand tour kind of bread painter in the mid 1700s that was European trained and working in the Caribbean, kind of almost at the behest of the governor of Dominica, so like the British crown. And they almost became kind of these sort of advertisements back to planters in Britain and in Europe as like early advertisements to invest in Caribbean colonial plantation projects. But he also did really, I think, kind of focus on women in the scenes, and there was all this kind of possibility in these paintings. So I kind of like again, through a little bit of like historical looking and things, sort of made this sort of painting world around it, and kind of rethought the relationships of the women in these paintings. And I like to think of my palette in this series as a kind of colonial kitsch, right? Because I'm kind of acknowledging the kind of I don't know, the kind of overabundance, the kind of like beautification that is trying to be glossed over the really violent plantation culture that he's making these paintings about, right? And trying to kind of do different things. But as a response, you know, the colors were kind of really sort of bright, and they're playing with ideas of kind of tropicala, but then they reject that as well. So I was coming off of a project that had a very different, had a really kind of explicit palette. And I was thinking about the sort of mid-century histories, mid-20th century histories I was working with that feel so much closer to now, that are still about racial construction and are still about the violence of racial capitalism, but had to deal with like photographic materials. And so I was like, I don't know what the palette for this would be. Right. And then I was kind of thinking about this idea of trace and sort of like the transformation of, you know, working with blueprints and documents, and the way that documents assert a kind of authority that they command, and very often needs to be questioned and doesn't deserve. And again, it's a version of history. And thinking about how do you sort of represent the idea of power that's in documents, and the kind of, again, kind of haunting of these materials. And so graphite in this sort of pared down way became a lot more, it resonated more as a material to kind of answer with. And I had come out, you know, part of Difficult Love, I was also working with drawings, and drawing specifically on black paper. I actually realize now it's been a long time since I've drawn on sort of objects on white paper. And there's something that kind of is so evocative about historical process and layering, and how standing in front of black paper with graphite, what becomes visible, what isn't as visible. So I think that there was a lot of, just again, the kind of materials of paper and the historical ephemera that I was looking at kind of led me to think, like, what is it, what would color, what does a palette look like in here? And if it doesn't feel true, then what else would how else could I do this? And so I think that was a little bit how I came to that conclusion. But it helped me to kind of take this, this year or so where I was working on a couple different projects that were mostly drawing based, and where I was really working kind of like layers of graphite and what felt visible and what did I want to remain kind of concealed. Because the next painting project that I'm in now, that I came back to, I was able to think more on those terms with a palette. So yeah, so that's how I ended up kind of like working in graphite in that. But I think that painting and drawing help me think through things with each other. I often think my drawing feels pretty different and sometimes looks pretty different. It almost feels like a different hand sometimes than my painting work, but they help me think through common problems with each other.
I love this idea of like how the idea and material really go hand in hand and help you kind of navigate the ideas, because it seems like a lot of what you bring into your work is rather organic. Like you said, you know, you're listening to a book here, and then you're asked to be in a show here, and things kind of weave together because you have your interests and your set, but then everything, it's just such a wonderful process. I feel like hearing about. Because I think it's how a lot of artists' brains work too, is we're like, okay, let's put this together. Let's think about this. How is this? Wait, what's happening here? And why do I have this feeling about it? You know?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it's really, really beautiful. Um, so now I'd love to ask you, you know, I love hearing about your ideas. I love hearing about your work. You teach, you're exhibiting. And I know there's some artists who are listening right now who are just kind of beginning on their path.
Yeah.
Do you have any advice that maybe like you've received that you think about when you're in your studio, when you're working, or that you like to give to students or artists that you could share with people listening?
Um, yeah, that's such a great question. I mean, um, I mean, I've received so much advice over this span of working. I mean, I've received so much generosity right? So much generosity from other artists and from teachers. I do have one thing that does often kind of stand out to me. That actually my dad said one time. I think part of the question is also it's about pathways, but it's also about kind of longevity, right? Like my like I've been working for a pretty long time, not so long, but I graduated from my MFA in like 2005. So that's a pretty long time, right? And I think that things weren't always really clear. And in terms of like what I was making, how I was making it. And I think that people have different kind of ways that they step into their career. And so this question of like finding questions has really kind of been my way in. But I remember one time I was, I don't know, I think I was talking to my dad and I was like, it's just really hard. I'm not kind of showing in places that feel like they maybe make sense for my work or the opportunities aren't coming. I don't know. I was just kind of griping. Right? I was having one of those days where I was just like, my dad asked what's going on. I was like, it's not good. And he kind of said, he was like, being an artist is really a privilege. And I don't think he meant it in that way of just sometimes the way that we kind of colloquially use privilege. Like I have various forms of privilege, absolutely. But also like a privilege is in like, so many people don't necessarily get listened to, and people don't stop to really think about what they're asking them to think about. And to be an artist, you're asking people to really stop and think about things with you, and presenting ideas and surfaces and layers and complexity. And you're asking people to stop and like take time to really look at it and take it in and think. And like that's, when you can pull it off, like it's really, it's such a privilege. And what do you kind of do with that? And so I think that it's made me, I think that sometimes stepping into my work, because I have historical reference points, or because they tend to be, I don't want to say research based, but there's kind of like these sort of layers going on that sometimes things aren't immediately apparent, or I'm asking maybe a viewer to do kind of hard work with me to think about subject matter. And I would say to not necessarily shy away from that, but to think about how you go about doing it, because that's really the beautiful part too, right? That's the part that makes your work your work. But it is a privilege to do it, and to have people being willing to kind of come along and listen to what it is they are trying to say or asking them to think about. So I think that a lot, and it makes me, I don't know, really. I think that sometimes I love painting, but I love being able to kind of like really talk to people about the ideas in the work as well. And that has become an important part for me of my practice. But then I also kind of hope that the work is an invitation for curiosity. So anyway, I guess that I would just, for artists that are sort of at different points in their career, or younger than I am, to kind of just keep on doing what you're doing and to kind of stay true to an idea. You can't make work that's not really authentic to you. It just doesn't work out that well. For me, it hasn't worked out to do that. Right. Like, so I think you kind of, even if it's moments of difficulty or figuring out the question of how to do it, like to just kind of keep on working at it, to invite criticism from people that you trust and critical thinking from people that you trust. And to kind of being able to live in a bit of discomfort at the beginning of a project, because I have often sort of the first pass at things can be, at least in my studio, the first pass at a new work in a series can be really, there's so many threads and things aren't kind of working the way I want them to. And, I think sometimes you can just put something down and walk away, but I think that there's a lot that can happen when you stay in a place that feels uncomfortable for a while and kind of like work through to the other side, because that's really like, that's all the stuff that opens up and you then figure out how to resolve further down the line, right? So I guess getting to know yourself and know your process, and not foreclosing on projects or ideas or processes too early on, right? Letting something bake all the way through, even if you have to throw out the first cake a few times. I don't know. That's a bad metaphor. I can't really think of a good one to use there, but yeah.
I love hearing this. Thank you, Alex's dad and Alex. I love that idea of it's a privilege to be an artist and not like like you said, privilege gets tossed around a lot. But when you really think about you are serving people, like you are bringing ideas to them and they are engaging with you. And that is a privilege to be able to have that conversation about tough topics. I'm kind of going to sit with that because I think that's something that I needed to hear as an artist too, in a way, because it's coming at it from a very different perspective than I think a lot of times we do in our practice. It's like, we got to get the show. There's like this thing that's happening. There's this happening, but taking it back to like, working together with your audience towards something bigger, I guess, and I think that's, something that we all need to keep in mind sometimes, like we're working towards something bigger. There's changes that need to happen. How do we work towards those together through a conversation that is not one-sided, right? There's the work that's produced, and then there's the people responding to it. So I think that's something I would.
Yeah. And, I don't know. I don't think that everything lands on everybody equally. I think especially in a lot of my projects, like I do as sort of the main person who I'm speaking to or writing this sort of like letter to are very often, especially in difficult love, Black women and sometimes dealing with violent histories, right? And finding ways to not reproduce that violence, but finding other ways to kind of like think through really difficult histories and their sort of ongoingness. And so I think you can have an audience in mind, but that idea of like, I guess, thinking that your audience is up to a challenge, I think it also, and will, feel be as interested or as serious about the things that you're kind of trying to convey. It also lends kind of, I think, grace into the work for me, which is the other thing about sort of having grace, right? Like, that means so many different things, but I just feel like in my career, I've kind of eaten a lot of humble pie, and it's like, it's like in some ways it hasn't, like, it's like not a comfortable thing, but it, I don't know, it's given me a lot to kind of think about, and also to be appreciative of the people that really kind of like want to stop and think about things with you. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, Alex, thank you so much for taking the time today to share about your practice, to talk about various projects that you've worked on, and offer up just this wonderful advice or thought that you have thought about in your practice from your dad, which I really like.
Well, so a lot of really great advice from both my parents, and I feel like so many, like basically every artist I've encountered my whole life. So I will just always say this to younger artists: if you can have an artist visit with somebody, always invite them into your studio, because there's like nothing but takeaways that are going to be so important later on, where you're kind of just like sitting around being like, what, how am I going to make sense of this? And then like this thing pops into your head that, someone said to you in grad school or a week ago, or your really good friend, was sort of noticing about your work. And they're just like words that help you understand how to get through whatever studio problem that you're working with. So that's really also such my like super advice to younger artists, is like, take the time to listen to people who have the generosity to give you words. Yeah. To give you their time.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, so good. Well, Alex,
thank you so much, Erica, for inviting me.
This has been amazing. Where can we find you online? Can you give us your website, Instagram, if you're on there, any of that info?
Yeah, my website is alexcallender.com, and my Instagram handle is @AlexisCallender, which is my name, Alexis. But nobody in my family really called me that growing up, so I just it was always Alex. So that's just who I am, Alex. But that's my Instagram, is @AlexisCallender.
Perfect. Well, we will link all of that in the show notes. We'll have images of your work. And again, just thank you so much for being with us today. So I hope you have a really great day.
You too. Thanks, Erica. Bye.
Bye.